can start. As you might know, this is the last lecture of this series, which was devoted to architectural books actually written by architects, with the I would say the intention to redefine the discipline of architecture. I think that, of course, there are many books on architecture, but there are very few books that have dared to propose a project that had completely reinvented the meaning and often, as we have seen in the previous presentations, also the practice of architecture. I just want to reiterate what I've said at the beginning, which I think today is a very important aspect of the two books that we are going to read. We have to consider these books, not only those presented today, but also all the books that we have discussed so far, as architectural projects. I personally am extremely uncomfortable with the idea, which is very common within academia, but also the general discourse on architecture, that there is such a thing as theory and practice. I think that I really believe that if architecture has a meaning, is exactly that it overcomes this dichotomy. Theory and practice, in a way, are equivalent, let's say, overlapping within the practice of architecture, in which, as I've tried to argue in this lecture series, in which actually writing plays a fundamental role. Writing is actually not just a commentary on design. Writing is not something that must either post-rationalize the design act or perhaps should, let's say, put forward the recipe, no? How to design. I think that this is, for me, a very problematic misunderstanding of what writing in architecture is. You know? I do believe that writing is of primary importance in architecture, and I would also argue that one of the reasons why today architecture seems to have lost a certain critical momentum is that writing has been completely delegated to professional writers. So very few architects write, and very few architects write with a certain, I would say, consistency. And actually, this really reminds me a little anecdote, which I hope I didn't already told you at the beginning of this seminar, which in fact was an anecdote that concerned my first encounter with Aldo Rossi, who was a teacher of mine in Venice. You have to understand that, of course, Venice is a public school, and so like any public school, the relationship teacher-students is slightly different from what you can enjoy here at the AA. So we were something like 600 students in his class. So the first time Rossi arrived, he of course take the microphone and say, okay, if you want to learn how to build, you have to go away from here because you will not learn how to build here. You have to go to a practice, to an office. But if you want to be an architect, you have to write a book, which of course was slightly confusing for many of us. We didn't understood what was the message and why an architect have to write a book. But in fact, I think that beyond the provocation, which was of course also slightly cynical, of course Rossi was very much disappointed by the condition of teaching 600 students, where in fact a more, let's say, articulated understanding of architecture was of course very difficult. Nevertheless, I think beyond the provocation, he pointed out precisely to this, I would say, property of architecture, which is very much concerned with the idea of the project, you know? And of course, writing is a fundamental instrument of a project. Sometimes writing is the only moment in which perhaps the architect can reclaim a certain, I would say, relative autonomy, you know, from the pressures that he has to confront within the field of the profession. No? And this is exactly the way, I would say, both Robert Venturi and Aldo Rossi understood writing. In a way, they were two architects who had no whatsoever ambition to become scholars. So today, most of the people who write in architecture sooner or later becomes either scholars or, let's say, bloggers. So Venturi and Rossi didn't really have any ambition to become scholars, but I don't think they also didn't have the ambition to simply entertain a public. Actually, they used writing as a way to restructure, to reform, to radically reinvent the idea of architecture. What is interesting is that both books are published in the same year, and this is a very interesting coincidence because, of course, Rossi and Venturi had no idea of each other. They would met later on. But both books share they have something in common. They're very different, as you will see, extremely different, but they have something in common. First of all, they are, as I just said, written by architects. Second, they, in a way, reject or take a distance from what at that time was very fashionable in architectural culture, which was a very technocratic understanding of architectural discipline. You have to understand that the 1960s are a period of extreme economic development, unlike now. So there was a lot of pressure to the profession to be, let's say, productive. And so architecture was very much understood as a discipline that would be immediately linked to the problem of design. Design actually is a word that, especially in the 50s and 60s, almost start to replace the word architecture. And of course, design really emphasized the managerial dimension of architecture. No? And this is exactly what Venturi and Rossi reacted against. They wanted to, in different ways, reclaim, in fact, architecture as a knowledge, as a form of knowledge, independent from let's say, from the most managerial technocratic understanding of the discipline. But of course, as you will see, they are also very, very different. Venturi actually, Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction is a book that very much focuses on the problem of architecture. Only later Venturi will, thanks to his wife, Denise Scott Brown, will focus on the city with his book, Learning from Las Vegas. Well, actually, the very peculiarity of Rossi's book is that it really emphasized the city as something that came before even architecture. And this, of course, is a very important difference between the two approaches to architecture. Rossi and Venturi actually are not what at that time, as I just said, professional writers. But they are, for different reasons, which I think would be too long to, in a way, now explain. They very much started their engagement with architecture mostly through writing, maybe more Rossi than Venturi. Venturi was also building something at the beginning of his career, but the importance of writing is not revealed through these two books, but through a kind of intense relationship that they have with publications, with reviewing books, with, in a way, studying certain architects, traveling a lot. Venturi actually spent a lot of his let's say, more formative years traveling, especially to Italy. In fact, a lot of material that he will analyze and publish in Complexity and Contradictions is photographs and material he would collect during his stays in Italy. Rossi actually is a very active writer. He's almost more active as a writer than as a designer, especially during his university years, starting very young to collaborate with very important magazines. So this is a very interesting aspect of their biography, because it's the beginning of a new kind of architect who maybe today is more recognizable, but who at that time did not really exist, who is the architect intellectual, the architect who, in a way, really engaged architecture not as a design issue, a design profession, but really as an intellectual project. And of course, for both of them, in, of course, not explicit terms, the model is Le Corbusier. For sure, I mean, even though both Rossi and Venturi have a rather conflictual relationship with Le Corbusier, in a way, Le Corbusier, who, as we have seen last time, has this profound relationship with writing, is a sort of role model that they try to follow. And I think this, the example of Towards an Architecture, though, of course, is a book that they would not follow and they would, to a certain extent, reject, is a kind of book that, with the architecture of the city and complexity and contradiction, they want to resurrect as a sort of format for books on architecture. Of course, both Venturi and Rossi are in a way also writing the book to reclaim architecture from what architecture has become, especially in the post-war era, period of reconstruction, where of course there is a huge, as I said before, pressure to architects to build, to realize, to construct cities that are more resembling factories than what used to be cities in the first half of the 20th century. This is, of course, a very important archetype of the modern American suburbia, Levittown, the first mass-produced suburban city in US, built especially for Second World War veterans. And of course, Levittown would become, in the, let's say, imagination of the post-war city, the post-city, the city that is no longer made by place, but by repetition, by settlement, let's say, schemes, and by infrastructure. And this is exactly what, in a way, would force, and Venturi is very open about that, architects to withdraw from the city. The moment actually the city is designed almost as a factory, where everything is mass-produced, there is very little, let's say, space of action for architects to really understand the relationship between architecture and the city. And this is exactly a very interesting, let's say, scenario in which we have to understand what Venturi and Rossi are trying to reclaim. But as you will see, they will have totally different positions. Of course, Venturi, this condition is an opportunity for architects to narrow their concern. He's very actually open, no, the beginning of complexity and contradiction, since this is the situation. This situation, which is of course very bad, can ironically be changed into an opportunity for the architect to only care about his work and not to bother about, let's say, larger social political issues. While actually for Rossi, the situation will be slightly more complex. Rossi will, in fact, try from a very, let's say, defined position to challenge this transformation of the city. And of course, both books react to late modern architecture, to the kind of moments in which modern architecture, unlike the first half of the 20th century, becomes very successful, especially thanks to the mass application of the welfare state. In Europe, actually, Europe will be reconstructed after the war through this social and political project, in which, of course, housing, especially housing and recreation, will play a fundamental role. This is actually one of the many new districts designed in Italy between the 1950s and the early 60s, and you see actually what kind of architecture this project produced, an architecture that of course had totally lost its typological, formal, but also social connection with the historical city. And of course, this will be a fundamental, again, challenge, no, to how architects would position themselves within this transformation. Of course, many architects would simply embrace this new condition, but few architects, and among them, for sure, Rossi, would question this sort of unprecedented transformation. Of course, you have to realize that in the case of Italy, this transformation was even more, let's say, tough, because Italy has a very strong historical, let's say, fabric. And of course, the arrival of this new district, these new places, was even more radical. Perhaps the best representation of this contrast are Michelangelo's Antonioni's movies, you know, especially the Eclipse and Red Desert, which really shows this incredible, almost alienating impact of these new districts in a city that for centuries had not had such a, let's say, massive reconstruction. And of course, we should not forget, and this maybe we'll discuss it later, that this project has also a huge, I would say, social and political impact on the city. I mean, the problem of the issue of housing is not just the design of architecture, it's also the design of new social relationships that, of course, were completely reformed under the idea that the city had no other meaning than to be productive. You know? Housing is exactly designed with that sort of goal, no? To reduce subjects to basically labor force. And of course, this implied a radical transformation of the city, where in fact this multiplicity of meanings that historical city implied was reduced to this narrow concern. Complexity and Contradiction actually is published, as I said before, in 1966 by the Museum of Modern Art. It's a book that from the very beginning has a tremendous success. In the introduction, the American historian Vincent Scully said in a quite bold, as a bold compliment, that Complexity and Contradiction is the most important book after Le Corbusier towards an architecture. So the idea that it's a book not written by a critic or an historian, but by an architect is made very clear at the very introduction of the book, and has a very particular aspect, which is a book that is fundamentally focused on the problem of form. Actually, the most crucial polemic put forward by Venturi, even before the kind of form that he wants to discuss, is that Venturi rejects completely any sort of social and political understanding of architecture. For Venturi, actually, the problem of architecture is a problem of what today we would call composition. Is a problem of finding or defining a formal approach in which, in fact, form is completely disconnected from any social, political, or ideological concern. And another very important aspect of the book, that it refers precisely to a fundamental, let's say, art historical paradigm, which is basically Mannerism. The word Mannerist or Mannerism or Mannerist architecture is a recurring topic in the whole book. And in fact, Venturi, in interviews and discussions that happened later, he reinforced the fact that the kind of architecture, the kind of approach to architecture that he was trying to support in Complexity and Contradiction is what we would call a Mannerist approach to architecture. As you might know, Mannerism is a very controversial art historical category, which was literally invented at the beginning of the 20th century to define a period of art history which is more or less, let's say, the second half of the 16th century. The term actually refers, actually is not really a positive term. It's a term that refers to an architecture that is extremely, not only complex, but full of formal inventions that are completely devoid of any, let's say, real commitment. So Mannerism is that period that art historians place in between High Renaissance, which is a period where, in fact, there is a strong, let's say, commitment to formal invention as an ideological tool, and to Baroque, which is also has the same kind of approach. Mannerism is a period in between in which formal invention becomes so dense, so articulated, so actually refined, that it lost completely its, let's say, moral, ethical, ideological values. And in fact, it's a kind of architecture that has been always, let's say, seen in very negative terms. There are very few, let's say, historians and later on architects who have embraced this approach to architecture, and Venturi is actually, for sure, not only one of them, but perhaps the most enthusiastic architect for this kind of architecture. Here, actually, I show you two examples of what is a Mannerist architecture, Michelangelo's Porta Pia, a gate that define the east entrance to Rome, and the Casino Pio by Piero Ligorio. And you see actually the characteristics of especially in the Casino, of Mannerist architecture. In principle, Mannerist architecture is not a complex architecture, unlike, for example, Baroque architecture. It's very simple, it's very schematic. For example, if you take away the strong kind of ornamental apparatus, the Casino Pio is a relatively simple building, a simple facade. But this sort of simplicity, of course, is countered by the incredible ornamental complexity, which very often has very little relationship with the actual architecture of the building itself. And also another very important aspect of Mannerist architecture, which will be very important for Venturi, is that it's an architecture of facades. The facades, unlike actually High Renaissance architecture, where there is always a strong relationship between elevation and plan, think of Bramante, but also Brunelleschi, in Mannerist architecture, the facade becomes almost an independent element, which of course allow the architect to have a very strong taste for formal invention. But of course, this formal invention is completely disconnected from the consideration of the whole building. And of course, this has a huge impact on Venturi. As you will see, I mean, if you actually flip through the book, you realize that I would say 70% of the images of the book are images of facades. And in fact, also Venturi's architecture is really, Venturi Scott Brown architecture is really an architecture of facade. And of course, this will be a fundamental, let's say, incipit of what will be one of the most important Venturi and Scott Brown theories of architecture, which is the theory of the decorated shed, in which, in fact, the decoration is not, is always applied to a very simple, let's say, schematic building. Of course, a characteristic of Mannerist architecture, here you see a modern, let's say, an old example and also a modern example, is that because it has this kind of, because the facade and the vertical elevation is always independent from the plan, it can more easily fit into a very complicated, let's say, site or context. Here you see a famous Mannerist building designed by Baldassare Peruzzi, in which actually the building is, let's say, tuned to a very complex, curvy street, or a very admired building by Venturi with Luigi Moretti, Casa del Girasole, in Rome, where in fact a very normal, let's say, I would say very banal residential building is transformed into a kind of bourgeois temple. But again, I would really want to stress how in both buildings actually the play of the facade becomes more important than the plan. Another very important influence, I would say the most important influence on Venturi's approach to architecture is the work of the new criticism. This is a very often overlooked, let's say, aspect of Venturi's complexity and contradiction, but if you read actually, especially the first two chapters, you realize that most of the quotes and the references, which are, of course, beyond architecture, are to the work of William Empson and other very important members of the New Criticism. New Criticism is a group of actually, it's not really a movement, but a loose group of American literary critics who were very crucial, important between the 1930s and the 1940s. And one characteristic of the new critics, especially in the work of the two poets, Allen Tate and William Hampson, was to consider the literary work as a pure formal artifact. And one of the techniques through which actually they developed this sort of approach, which of course is highly controversial, was what they would call close reading. Close reading is a way to read an artwork, a book, but also a painting or even an architecture, without referring to anything external to the artifact itself. So it's a pure formalist understanding of art, where in fact everything that is not, even the author's intention, everything that is applied or beyond the artifact itself is completely excluded from criticism. So new critics would just take a book, a poem, and they would simply read the text. So they would do exactly the opposite of the way I'm explaining to you these books. They would simply open the book, almost forget that these books were written in a very specific historical time, that there were certain intentions, that there were certain, let's say, ideas that informed the book, and they would just trust the text as it is, which of course resulted in masterful readings of books that would completely ignore class, gender, or racial issues that of course are always present in any text, in any artwork. And this actually is the fundamental, let's say, influence on Venturi's complexity and contradiction, especially William Empson's book, 7 Types of Ambiguity. In fact, one of the, let's say, argument or topic or issues that the new critics would be very interested in was precisely the idea of ambiguity. The idea that any text, no matter how straightforward, no matter how clear, no matter how articulated, would always contain sort of moments in which meaning is not sure anymore. So there is a very interesting link between the Mannerist sensibility that Venturi wants to put forward in architecture and actually what the new critics were trying to develop in their own close reading of literature and poetry. And in fact, it's fair to say that what Venturi is trying to do in Complexity and Contradiction is to apply new criticism, the principle of new criticism, to architecture. Of course, there are other influences, much more, let's say, on the level of really architecture and contemporary, what was the contemporary architecture to Venturi. For sure, one of them is Louis Kahn. Venturi has worked with Louis Kahn, and Louis Kahn, between the 1950s and 60s, is an extremely powerful and influential architect. This is actually one of his best projects, and perhaps one of the most important early projects by Kahn, the Escherich House. What is actually really interesting about Kahn and what will have a certain influence on Venturi is that perhaps Kahn is the first modern architect, let's say, to return to the theme of the wall. If you see any building by Kahn, you could hardly see, let's say, the modern typical plan. Kahn actually really recuperates the idea of an architecture made by governed by facades and wall. And also to a partie of architecture that is very both classical, but at the same time, especially in his early work, very often disturbed by rather dissonant elements. So not so much the later Can, which will be much more monumental and bombastic in his recuperation of classical architecture, but the early Can really has this very interesting play between, for example, symmetry. You can see this very well in the plan of the house, which he developed around a very symmetrical, let's say, two-bay plan. But then the symmetry is challenged by a rather dissonant placement of the service, service elements and the stair, no? And it creates this kind of very strange form in between extreme symmetry and also a rather, let's say, asymmetrical play of forms. Of course, this will be very important for Venturi's understanding of architecture, which is all basically based on this principle. All the examples that Venturi's actually choose are all very conventional. I mean, Venturi's actually never choose very complex examples, but where this convention is constantly challenged by rather deviant forces, no? Where, in fact, ambiguity becomes the fundamental, let's say, topic of all these buildings. I mean, Venturi is really interested in an architecture that, where elements can mean something and something else at the same time. And his selection is very inclusive. That's actually one of the most annoying things about complexity and contradiction, is that he rather almost literally reread the entire history of, let's say, Western architecture from, let's say, Middle Age to the 20th century. There are too many examples, I would say, and also his comments are very often very short. But in a way, this inclusivism is really, in a way, also part of the strategy of the book, no? To not, unlike Le Corbusier, to not focus on few explicit canons, few explicit examples, but to a variety that, in fact, challenge one of the fundamental aspects of complexity and contradiction, which is exactly the clarity of the text. Venturi is a very good writer. He's very clear. He's very straightforward. I mean, Venturi's writing style, unlike Rossi, he's extremely crisp and is never actually, I mean, has a very profound economy of words. And for me, there is a very interesting contrast between the straightforward, the extremely clear writing style of Venturi and the incredible, almost plenty of variety of examples that he offers in the book, where he constantly juxtaposes examples of modern and pre-modern architecture. For example, this is actually one typical page of the second edition. You see how this is a very interesting aspect of the book. Images become more important than text. I would argue that Complexity and Contradiction can be read almost as a picture book, where text is almost like a series of captions of the images themselves. Also, the images are very well chosen, very well composed, and in fact, they really resurrect the idea of Le Corbusier towards an architecture, where in fact the juxtaposition of images, especially of very odd juxtapositions, which, for example, in Le Corbusier were the famous juxtaposition of the Parthenons and the automobile. In Venturi's actually juxtaposition is not taking items outside of architecture, but nevertheless these juxtapositions are often very strange. For sure, to juxtapose Borromini and Lutens is not something that at that time was very normal to do in a book on architecture. A very important also aspect, perhaps the most important concern of Venturi, apart from the idea of ambiguity, is the relationship between inside and outside. As you know, in modern architecture, this is but I would say also from Renaissance on, the relationship between inside and outside is one of the most fundamental topic, of Western architecture. I mean, there is something almost moral and ethical in the way the interior of a building manifests itself into the outside, into public space. So there are very few architects that have explicitly, not just practically, but explicitly challenged this topic. One of them is for sure Venturi, who actually made really a strong point in claiming that the most interesting aspect of architecture is the way the interior meets the exterior, the way actually the inside meets the outside. And in fact, he showed a series of examples where this sort of relationship is extremely exacerbated. Venturi is really against the idea that the inside should basically be manifested by the outside of a building, which is a fundamental principle of modern architecture, and instead proposed this idea where the outside, the facade, becomes completely an independent element from the whole of the building. And in fact, this is exactly what will tune Venturi's approach to architecture, which, as I said, have very little to do with the city, to let's say what for later on for Venturi will become a very important application of his principle, which is precisely the city. After Complexity and Contradiction, Venturi will reinforce the relationship with his then let's say wife, Denise Scott Brown, who will have a huge impact on his work. I think really we can say that there is a pre-Scott Brown Venturi and post-Scott Brown Venturi. And I think that the influence of Denise Scott Brown on his late work is extremely important. And unfortunately, I have really no time to mention that part of Venturi's work, which is very important because it's also very different from Complexity and Contradiction. But I think that this page is for me very telling about this difference. Here actually Venturi is one of the few moments in Complexity and Contradiction where Venturi talks about the city. And it shows actually these four images. Of course, the images on the left are the good examples of what could be a city where complexity play a vital role. One, of course, is Venice, and the second is Times Square in New York. And Venturi actually praised these two examples as a sort of vital idea of complexity in the urban landscape, where different styles, but also different patterns, different conditions are present at the same time. And then there are two images of Levittown on the right, which are exactly the kind of landscape, especially the photograph on top that Venturi and Scott Brown will celebrate in Learning from Las Vegas. But actually here Venturi is very negative about these examples. He really shows these examples as exactly where once the city has lost this kind of intense complexity, lost completely the scale and the dimension of an architectural, let's say, environment. And this is very interesting because only through the work with Denise Scott Brown, Venturi will be able to link his rather conservative approach to architecture, which is very strong in Complexity and Contradiction, and not to mention that new critics, especially in the 1960s, are criticized, as I said, are the open reference to Venturi, criticized as very not only conservative but also regressive, let's say, readers of modern literature. So it's very daring from Venturi to use that reference for his book. But this page really shows the way in which Venturi will be able to link his early book to the work he will do with Denise Scott Brown. And in fact, one of the characteristics of Learning from Las Vegas will be precisely to abandon the idea of plasticity and architectural form as understood in complexity and contradiction. And in fact, through Denise Scott Brown, Venturi will be very much focused on the theme of iconography, the theme of the two-dimensional image, which is something that very often he criticized in Complexity and Contradiction. And through this sort of idea of iconography and two-dimensional image, he will be able actually to apply his categories and his reading of complexity and contradictions into the American landscape, which of course in Complexity and Contradiction was a little bit, let's say, edited out, apart from the famous image of Main Street. But one of the characteristics of let's say, Complexity and Contradiction, that it ends with a series of projects by Venturi himself. So Venturi really makes clear that all this is a sort of introduction to his own design approach. This is a famous house designed for his mother in 1964, where you see actually Venturi is really trying to apply this Mannerist style, no? Where very conventional elements. The house is a very suburban, normal house, but what is interesting that all the elements are basically out of scale. You see this huge pediment and this huge window on the left. This is really actually the idea of an architecture that play with very conventional normal elements, but place them in a very, let's say, odd context. The plan also is very similar to the plan I've shown you before by Khanna. You still have this very strict, almost symmetrical layout, which is then completely changed and deformed by elements that are placed in a very odd way, like, for example, the stair. And also, of course, the non-coincidence between the partition of the plan and the facade. So the facade becomes a completely independent element. So, but as I said before, actually, once you read a Complexity and Contradiction, you really get this idea of that there is really nothing to do anymore with the city. So architecture is only a matter of designing, making architecture, which is, I would say, also an approach that is very often reformulated, especially in times of crisis where architects are somehow disoriented by the transformations of the city. And this is actually very different from Rossi's approach to architecture. I mean, unlike Venturi, Rossi's idea to write a book on architecture is to really write architecture from the point of view of the city. And in fact, the title is very explicit about that. Rossi is actually reacting to a very, the book actually has to be read as a reaction to a very specific, let's say, polemic, which is Rossi's polemic against planning. Rossi tried to argue that one of the fundamental problems of planning is that it totally dissolved the resolution, the physical but also political resolution of the city into something that is very abstract and therefore lacks a sort of tangible resolution. You have to understand that precisely between the 50s and in 1960s, of course, with a strong emphasis on the welfare state and its, let's say, new urban scale, where in fact housing but also production, leisure play a fundamental role, planning was seen as far more important than architecture. And this is exactly the issue that Rossi, with his book, wants to challenge. Of course, the result of this sort of importance of planning in terms of architecture was basically the exaggeration of the scale of architecture itself. A project that was very popular in the early 60s was Kenzo Tange proposal for Tokyo Bay in 1961. It's a project that in the early 60s would have a huge impact in the discussion about the new scale of the city. You know? Tange actually designed a city where which is first of all outside of the actual Tokyo. It's basically a floating city on the bay itself. So this gave the opportunity to Tange to completely redesign the city, in fact, almost as a machine where all the working and leisure activities are concentrated in the middle, in this very long spine, and housing is actually a sort of plug-in to this system. Rossi actually was very critical of this project. In one of his early projects, which I will not show you today, was really a critique of this particular project by Tange, which, as you see, really completely reinvented the city in the very tabula rasa of the Bai of Tokyo. But also, Rossi was somehow critical also to the sort of reaction to these new transformations of the city. Of course, one reaction was to reclaim a certain historical image of the city. This is a very famous high-rise building designed by the office BBPR. The main architect of this office was Ernesto Nathan Rogers, a very important mentor for Rossi. Of course, Rossi was in very good terms with Rogers, but in a way, he was very uncomfortable with the sort of approach that Rogers put forward in this famous building, the Torre Velasca, where in fact a high-rise tower, which is a very disruptive typology, is sort of masked by a sort of architectural style that resemble some sort of Gothic motifs. And of course, Milan is a very important city for a Gothic style, I mean the famous dome. And Rossi actually was very uncomfortable with this sort of rather epidermical, very, very stylistic defense of the historical city. And this is exactly what, precisely this impasse. On one hand, this kind of very technocratic approach which completely bypass the idea of the city as a sort of historical structure. But on the other hand, also this architecture that tried to mimic the historical city through very stylistic motifs. This is exactly what that pushed Rossi to engage with writing. He was a very important editor of the magazine Casabella. In 1958, he edited 1959, sorry, he edited a very important issue of Casabella on Adolf Loos. Adolf Loos at that time was rather unknown. It was known, but not as it is famous today. Today is very much recognized as a very important figure in the development of modern architecture. That was not at all the case. And Rossi actually is one of the first to really rediscover, in fact, Loos as a very important figure of modern architecture. So this is a very interesting I would say, approach. The project of Rossi is not to reject the modern architecture like Venturi, but to rediscover its most ambiguous and perhaps unexplored territories. But I think that one of the fundamental, I would say the most important encounter that will trigger Rossi to write a book like The Architecture of the City is his discovery of two authors who are extremely important for Rossi. I would argue that if Rossi would not have read these two authors, he would have never write The Architecture of the City, who are Marcel Poet and Maurice Holbachs, two very important sociologists, geographers, members of what later on we would call the French School of Geography, who actually, in the first half of the 20th century, would rediscover, of course, within urban geography and sociology, a sort of holistic approach to the city. At that time, at the time when these two authors were working, the city was either understood as a mere, let's say, sociological fact, think of the Simmel writings on the city, or as a pure artifact, as a pure formal compositional, let's say, structure. Think of all books written on the CD, especially till the 1950s or 1940s, where in fact the word urbanism almost does not exist. I mean, we are very much used to the term urbanism, no? But for the term urbanism becomes popular only since the 1950s. In fact, till the 1950s, there is no really an urban culture. No, there are architects who work on the city. There are philosophers who write about the city. There are sociologists who work on the city. Think of the famous Chicago School of Urban Sociology. But there are no really intellectuals who take the city as a whole. I mean, takes the city as a physical but also social and political artifact. And the work of Poet and Holbachs is in fact a pioneer of this approach, which of course will be extremely important for Rossi. I mean, Rossi will in fact be almost his first actually project to write a book was not to write a book called The Architecture of the City, but was his idea was to write a book called Manuale dell'Urbanistica, Manual of Urbanism. And in fact, the title really betrayed this kind of incredible influence of these two figures, especially, I would argue, the work of Maurice Holbachs, who wrote a very important book on collective memory. And in fact, this will be a fundamental category in Rossi's book. And I would say that most of the ideas that Rossi put forward on this topic are basically taken from Holbachs, who, of course, at that time was almost unknown to architects. A very important reference are also two books from which actually Rossi take almost literally the title. Hilbersheimer Großstadtarchitektur, which, as you know, is translated as the architecture of the big city. Actually, the actual translation now is metropolis architecture, but I think it's a rather misleading translation. And the image of the city by Kevin Lynch. So this is exactly the kind of approach that Rossi had in mind, an holistic approach to the city, an approach that would place architecture within social science, but would, unlike these books, would make architecture more important as a last tangible fact that solidify all the influences that in fact had to do with the development of the city. And in fact, it's precisely the opportunity for Rossi to teach in Venice between 1963 and 1965 that will materially give him the possibility to write the book. Rossi is assistant professor in Venice, and one of the focus of his research is the problem of typology. Actually, it's very, the way actually Rossi arrived to this topic is extremely, to say, serendipitous. Rossi at that moment is basically jobless, and he literally don't know what to do. He also loses post as editor of Casabella, and by pure chance get a scholarship to do a very boring mapping of the 19th century block in Milan. So something that jobless architects can do. And thanks to this very serendipitous opportunity, he started to be interested in the problem of typology, because of course a fundamental methodology through which one reads the urban fabric of the city is precisely typology. And Rossi actually understands that typology can become a sort of scientific framework through which this holistic approach to the city can be formulated from the vantage point of architecture. So that's actually why typology becomes almost an obsession, I would say, for the early Rossi. For Rossi, typology is not, let's say, as we very often discuss it today, the figure or the representation of specific buildings. We use actually the term typology to very often understand the function or the program of a building, no? A school or an hospital, no? We call them typologies. But for Rossi, typology has nothing to do with, nor actually a programmatic identity of buildings, nor with their actually actual formal, let's say, layout. For Rossi, actually, typology is a sort of formal organization of buildings that is independent from their own, let's say, actual materialization, their actual construction. In other words, you can only understand typology if you compare different buildings. If you compare different buildings, you realize that these buildings share something, share a certain formal organization. For example, a very important typology in the 19th century cities, the gallery type. So a huge corridor with basically many rooms that are adjacent to this corridor. So this for Rossi is a typology, but this typology cannot be identified as one building. You need actually a family of buildings, you need a series of buildings to define this the typological theme. No? And so Rossi said very explicitly in the book, there is no way you can reduce typology to one building, but you can always reduce each building to one typology. So typology is a framework that allows Rossi to go beyond the, let's say, the actual singularity of building, therefore allow Rossi to go beyond authorship. This is actually a very fundamental category through which architecture is always understood. No? If you take any book on architecture, any art historical book, or you will always understand basically architecture as a sort of series of authors. No? I mean, there is it's very difficult to escape this way to identify architecture. Well, for Rossi, the idea of typology, the idea of identifying architecture through a framework that is irreducible to the singularity of one building, was a way to question this way of reading architecture and therefore reading the city. Because what Rossi put forward is really the common of the city, which is this collective intelligence that takes form of specific typological frameworks, which are specific to certain places and certain historical times, and which really define basically they're very specific, but at the same time generic, because of course they relate to not a singular building or a singular author, but to a milieu of buildings which very often coincide with the city itself. But at the same time, in order to read these let's say the typologies, in order to understand their unfolding into the structure of the city, architecture has to be analyzed, according to Rossi, as an artifact, as a structure that has a clear boundaries, that has no whatsoever organic relationship with the city, and only by this sort of self-containment of architecture is possible to understand this rather complex background. Now, it's very paradoxical. There is a very interesting tension between these two positions. Now, because on one hand, Rossi argues for a rather general, no, almost generic reading of the city, which cannot be, let's say, reduced to the singularity of each architectural intervention. So there are certain things, Rossi seems to suggest, that cannot be controlled by one architect or one building or one client, no? Which is the formal organization that we necessarily have to basically accept in order to propose a particular project. I mean, if you design a house, it will be very difficult for you to avoid corridors. Or if you design a museum, it will be very difficult to avoid certain typological, let's say, sort of properties. Huh? Well, actually, so for Rossi, typology is really something that goes beyond the individual will, no, of the architect, and really has a certain impact on the city in general. But at the same time, the only way to read these transformations, to only read this sort of collective intelligence, for Rossi is only through the individuality of the urban artifact. And Rossi really stressed this idea of individuality. Individuality means that at the end, architecture has a finite dimension, no? The dimension of one form, of one project, that nevertheless, precisely because it's so self-contained, no? So defined in its own terms, allow us to understand how these rather complex categories take form within the city. And that's actually, I would say, for me, the beauty also of the architecture of the city, that between these two terms through which Rossi discussed the city, there is no cause and effect relationship. Rossi really leaves open the gap, no, between the scale of the city, which is something that Rossi really stressed in its own holistic dimension, but at the same time, the only way we can know this structure is through the individuality of its own, let's say, urban artifacts, which for Rossi are often the monuments, the most, let's say, representative buildings of a city, which really has this sort of capacity to become cross-sections, no, of this holistic, let's say, reading of the city itself. Unlike actually Venturi's book, Rossi, especially the first edition of the book, there are very, very few pictures. Most of the pictures are old or ancient monuments, which of course at that time was a very provocative position, because the book was clearly understood as a book by an architect and someone who wanted to basically be part of a contemporary discourse on architecture. So it was a very iconoclastic gesture to have images that, and references that were mostly pre-modern structures, which of course Rossi really insists, no, that the city, the modern, in fact for Rossi the modern city does not exist, no? It's a kind of ideological category, because even the modern city is forced to accept the fact that it's only a sort of reform and reconstruction of something that already has existed before, no? What we chronologically discuss as the modern city. And of course, another very important aspect that for Rossi is very important, I mean, that's very crucial, sorry, is the role of also unbuilt projects. This is actually a very famous unbuilt project by a neoclassic Milanese architect, which is basically not realized, but the actual topography of the city in a way sort of recall the same formal and spatial organization. So for Rossi, the architecture of the city is not only the architecture, the literal architecture of the city, what has been produced, but also a project that has not been realized, that nevertheless has a certain resonance and importance in the way the city develops. Unlike actually Venturi, in the architecture of the city, there are no projects by Rossi. So Rossi actually doesn't want to bind his book to his design proposals. There are no mentions in his book to his work, which is, I found a very interesting aspect compared to Venturi's book, but also to books like There is in New York by Colas, in the sense that really Rossi wants to make the knowledge of the architecture of the city independent from a design method. Nevertheless, I think it's very interesting to see what Rossi did while actually writing the book, while and after writing the book, because of course there is a certain relationship. First of all, a very important relationship is this attempt to design buildings which figure forth this typological dimension of architecture. As we have seen, typology is not something you can manifest through one building. No? Typology is more a collective intelligence that you can understand across different buildings. This is a very important understanding of typology, which I think has been very often misunderstood. Nevertheless, there is a certain architectural approach that emphasizes this typological understanding of architecture. And this, it's a sort of architecture that really rely on pre-existing formal organizations, like, for example, the grid, no? the most typological, the most important typological datum of a city. No? Many cities rely on the gridiron, no? as a spatial formal organization. So in this case, actually, the grid becomes not let's say, the datum of the city, but the datum of one particular project, which is the San Rocco housing scheme for the city of Monza, where you see actually that the architecture is literally based on the principle of the gallery and the grid, so two themes that are not formal but typological. And the architecture is almost just the extrusion of these principles. There is nothing more than just, let's say, the attempt to extrapolate this logic to a degree that anything else is almost left aside. You know? So this is a totally different approach from Venturi. Venturi is really interested in the singularity of each architectural element, you know? Windows, doors, facades. On the contrary, Rossi really tried to go beyond that sort of local dimension of architecture and recuperate the very distribution, the very formal organization of the, not of just the building itself, but the settlement principle of architecture. And I think the San Rocco project is one of the few projects where he really achieved that sort of clarity, which will be lost, I think, in later projects. I mean, another project which I think is very interesting in this, within the Rossi's attempt to work within a typological architecture is the residential building at Galaratese. It's the first large-scale project realized by Rossi. It's a housing scheme, and again here Rossi played with with actually one actually typological theme, which is the theme of the gallery. Again, Rossi was very obsessed with this particular typology because, of course, it's a typology that refers a lot to the place where Rossi was designing these buildings, which is Lombardy, especially Milan, where the gallery is a fundamental typological theme of a lot residential, pre-modern residential architecture. So Rossi really wants to play with that sort of theme. And what is interesting is that the building is actually a rather low-rise building. It's just 2 floors. So it's a very interesting situation where a 2-floor building has a very huge gallery, both the galleries that serve the apartment, but also the gallery on the ground floor, which of course becomes the main architectural image of the building. In fact, you could say that what is interesting that also the idea of using typology is to exaggerate aspects of architecture that would never otherwise be completely unappreciated, I mean, completely lost in the design process. I mean, this is also very crucial when you design. No? We tend to accept typological constraints, no? And Rossi actually insisted on this idea of estranging them and making them the theme of architecture itself. And of course, it's a very difficult method because it's a method that questions very fundamental issues about the design process. And that's actually also why Rossi and very few people after him were, I mean, Rossi was not able to basically carry on this method because it's the typology, when you design, play with typology, you are not simply trying to change the facade or the form of a building. You're really challenging aspects of distribution and therefore fundamental political conditions that are established by the building itself. And this is actually why Rossi was not able to really carry on this project. Only in one project, well, only in one occasion Rossi has been able to sort of produce a very interesting follow-up of the architecture of the city, which is basically his project for the Città Analoga, what I would argue is the best project by Rossi. It's a very interesting project because at the beginning, Città Analoga was supposed to be a book, which Rossi started to write immediately in the late 60s, so after l'Architettura della Città, the architecture of the city. And it was a book in which Rossi was trying to explain how certain principles of the architecture of the city could be applied as a design method. For many reasons, actually, Rossi was never able to produce this book. So in 1976, he was invited by the first installment of the Venice Biennale of Architecture. And in this Biennale, he actually produced this drawing, which is very interesting because it's a huge, it's not really a drawing, it's actually a huge collage made with Xerox copies, which then was transformed into a serigraphy. And this actually drawing contained both projects by Rossi. I mean, you see the San Rocco, but also the Gallaratese and the monument in Segrate, his first realized project, but also references from other cities and from other buildings. I mean, there are actually it's really a long list of reference from Le Corbusier Rochemp, which is basically somewhere here. You cannot see it because it's very small, to Piranesi, to Tanzio da Varallo, to the city of Pavia. So there are Milizia, of course, a very important reference for Rossi. So it's a huge collage of all kinds of reference, which were important for Rossi's work, but also were collected and composed together in a way that the project of the city would be presented not as one plan. I mean, in a way, the Città Analoga is a profound radical critique to the idea of the plan, to the idea of that the only way we can design the city and design architecture is through that fundamental tool that is basically the plan. And what I'm saying by referring by the plan is not just the actual orthogonal horizontal projection of a building. Plan really as a design strategy, no? There is no way we can put forward a project for the city or for architecture without making a projection, no? Which is exactly the idea of the plan, no? Which imply a fundamental process of abstraction. On the contrary, Rossi was very much trying to put forward a design method that would go beyond the idea of the plan, that would basically refers directly to paradigms, to examples. So in a way, what Rossi is trying to do is to put forward a way to design based on paradigms and examples as opposed to the idea of the plan. And of course, a fundamental aspect of examples is that examples are not abstractions, are real concrete references, and you see them here, which of course are irreducible to any, let's say, design tool like scale, but also projection, as I've said, and they can only manifest themselves as they are, as forms. And I think this is really the way through which Rossi wanted to overcome the impasse of typology. Rossi arrived to a point that he really don't know how to, let's say, how to play with typology within the design process. So in a way, the idea of shifting from typology, which at the end can be a very abstract framework, to the idea of example and paradigm, is exactly what he was trying to do in this project, in this plan, which was meant to be the follow-up of the architecture of the city. What is interesting that there is an early version of Città Analoga, which was painted by very important Rossi's, let's say, follower, Arduino Cantafora, which actually, as you see, was an attempt to make a city out of references, out of projects built or unbuilt that already existed. You can see Boulez, Hilbersheimer, Adolf Loos, Antonelli and Rossi himself. So the city, in a way, it's not a plan, but it's a collage, a composition of different buildings, realized and unrealized. But Rossi actually was very unhappy about this version of the città analoga, because, of course, it's too literal. It's too much based on the idea that these references are presented as one landscape, which is also very strongly made by the perspectival order of the main axis, no? That is at the very center of the città analoga. Rossi actually wanted to have something that was less literal, more where the references could both be part of a composition, but at the same time also free from being constrained within a very strong order, like you can see in this painting. And that's actually why he basically chose this particular way of representation, which is in a way very well composed. I mean, there is a very strong sense of symmetry, but at the same time, the different references are also freed from a particular scale or any other sort of reference within the overall composition. And I think this is exactly what Rossi was trying to put forward in the città analoga, a project for the city beyond the idea of the plan, basically, which of course remains an unfinished project, remains actually a project that Rossi was never able to carry on. You know? And I think that for me, this approach of a project for the city that relies on architecture, but at the same time bypass the mastering of an overall plan, I think it's, especially today where in fact the state can no longer support an overall plan for the city, is a very interesting approach which unfortunately Rossi was never able to carry on beyond this rather interesting and I would say also radical project. So to conclude actually this very long marathon, which actually started from Vitruvius, I would say that I think that I mean, one of the conclusions I feel to make out of this series, and maybe this is open to debate, although I mean, it's very late and I'm really sorry for not being as fast as usual, is that architecture really has always been instrumentalized, no? Not just as a technique, but also as a moral and ethical framework in which our knowledge is somehow condemned to be optimistic. I mean, it's condemned to carry on the project of the city, regardless whether this project is good or bad. I mean, for me, it's interesting that no architect has never radically put in question the city itself. No, architecture is always trying to develop strategies, techniques to basically allow the city to develop in one direction or another. Of course, with very few exceptions. I mean, we have seen how Venturi has completely disconnected himself from the problem of the city. And I have to say that, rereading in battery all these books, and I have to say I really like architecture. I mean, I'm not at all a sort of cynical critic of architecture. I mean, it has a certain very strong enthusiasm. And the way I've been trying to read these books is really from the side of architecture. I mean, I'm not an historian, a critic. I'm really an architect, and I have a certain childish enthusiasm for architecture, which is also very uncritical. But I have to say that rereading all these books, I've been left with a very bitter taste, which is exactly the fact that architecture, by necessity, by its very DNA, which is really to construct, is always condemned to arrive with solutions. I mean, in a way, architecture has always have to find solutions, and of course, anything that is not in that direction is not architecture. I mean, we talk about something else. And that's actually why I like to end up with this drawing, no? Because for me this drawing can have two interpretations. One, which is which is the commitment to the city, which I think is very important. I think that's what architecture today has lost, no? The fact that the city is the only place where architecture makes sense, where architecture has its own raison d'etre. And I think I've been always extremely supportive of this idea, and I like the fact that in this drawing, architecture dissolves almost itself within the city. You know? The city takes over architecture. But at the same time, this drawing is also show us the impossibility of an architectural project that, in a way, gives to the city a definitive order. And I don't think this is necessarily a good thing. I think it could be also very negative things for architecture. But nevertheless, it's also architecture, by showing clearly this failure, perhaps show us the possibility through which we can also take a distance from architecture itself, especially as a form of practice, and understand architecture, and that's actually really what I was trying to put forward in these seminars, as a form of knowledge. I would make almost, I mean, you know, there is a famous sentence by De Chirico, no? A very famous Italian painter, who once said, well, painting is for philosophers who have overcome the problem of philosophy. And I would say that, in a way, architecture, apart from being a design activity and, you know, a profession, as we all know, can be thought as a sort of form of philosophy for those who have overcome the problem of philosophy, you know, who have actually accepted that things take place in the real space, not within ourselves, but outside ourselves. And this space is very important and a source of perhaps what produces us. We are not producing this space, this space that produces us. And I think that this drawing shows, to me, the possibility that this knowledge becomes independent from design, without being necessarily a scholar, a form of scholarship, but an instrument to understand where we are and actually what is to be done. Perhaps by designing, or maybe not. Thank you. It's very late, so I don't know if there are questions. I really apologize for going really over time, but yes.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. I've got two questions. The first one is, I don't know if you're aware of the fact that Bartlett Professor Frederick Meger organized an exhibition on La Tendenza at the Centre Pompidou.
Yeah.
And I would like to know what you think about that, the way it was organized and the reading of the whole movement.
Actually, I have to confess that and it's really a shame, for several reasons, I didn't have the chance to see the exhibition. I saw the catalog, but I didn't saw the exhibition, and I've heard from people who have visited the exhibition that it was very beautiful. I mean, it was a very, it was very interesting. Judging from the catalog, I think that I think it was a good exhibition, but also a bit imprecise in framing, actually. I mean, if the topic was Tendenza, which is this group of architects who were working together with Rossi from the late 60s and early 70s, the focus was, of the exhibition itself was far larger. I mean, it was really an exhibition on Italian post-war, or the Italian architecture between the 60s and the 80s. So that's actually the only judgment I can make, because I don't feel, I mean, not having seen the exhibition, which is really a shame because I really wanted to see it, but for, unfortunately, several reasons I couldn't go to Paris. So judging from the catalog, to me, the focus of the exhibition was slightly different from what the title of the exhibition was putting forward. What is interesting is also the reaction of many people who were part of that group, how they reacted to the exhibition. For example, Massimo Scolari and Giorgio Grassi, who were somehow very close to Rossi, have refused to show their work in that exhibition. So it's a very controversial thing. So I think that we need more historical distance to really evaluate that period, you know, in those terms as a kind of movement. I think that that's why I actually didn't really spoke about the tendenza. For me, there is a huge discrepancy between the work of Rossi and the work of the people who actually have followed his work. And I think that the focus of the exhibition was really trying to give this more collective representation of his work. But for me, it's very problematic, this sort of collective representation. I don't think that, I mean, there is a huge gap between Rossi himself and those people who were around him, with the exception of very few people like Scolari and Grassi, who actually were not present in the exhibition.
Thank you. And I have another very short one. Could you please tell us about the main strands of critique to Rossi's work?
Well, actually, Rossi, especially when I was student, was the most hated architect by everybody, especially by students. Partly, it was understandable. Rossi actually, in the late 70s and 80s, became a very successful architect. And I think the success paralyzed his work into a very recognizable signature style, which unfortunately coincided with also a series of events of Rossi's personal life. And so after, I think, the mid-70s, his work didn't really go further. So, but paradoxically, that's part of the work that becomes most known. The Rossis of the sketches and his, private world of fantasies. This is actually really the Rossi that becomes extremely popular in the 80s. And I think that for me, this criticism, which I think it's very often quite deserved, in a way missed the early Rossi, which I think not only is a very interesting architect, but also an architect that really left unfinished a project. I really believe that one of the most interesting things about Rossi's work is that his project was unfinished. It's not like Mies or Le Corbusier, where his project, or Venturi, their project is finished. I mean, it's very difficult to understand what to add, to Mies' work, for example, which is, absolutely perfect. I think Rossi's, what is interesting about Rossi is because actually he left this project unfinished, there is something more potential, especially for me with this drawing, in fact, it's a drawing that has not produced something after it, and yet is very pregnant of very interesting ideas, which for me makes more sense today than then. So in that sense, I think that that's actually for me the strength of Rossi, is that perhaps more than other architects has this dimension of being unfinished, an unfinished project with almost an invitation to carry on this project and to be even more radical than what Rossi at the end ended to be. Yes?
According to the cover of the plan, according to the idea of the plan, Rossi, in the architecture of the city, he refers to the German Siedlungs, saying that, of course, referring to the problem of urban morphology, and that not just have to deal with the horizontal development, but at the same time vertical relationships and at the same time with a more complex geometry, could be said. But do you have something to add? Because he's so brief to refer to that problem that it's like maybe there is something else that's missing. Because that chapter is so short that.
No, I think that well, I mean, there is not so much to add, but to the fact that Rossi had a very interesting relationship with these projects. He was both a big fan of these hardcore modernist schemes, and you can see that also in his early work. He really looked to figures like Ernst May, Hilbersheimer. But at the same time, he was also very frustrated by this kind of insistence on the plan. And I think that that's why actually in the book, those moments or those paragraphs or chapters, like for example the chapter on the paragraph on Berlin, where he really wants to say something about modern architecture, he's very short. Well, actually, when it comes to the Roman Forum, which is one of the examples that he really talks, that he really put forward, especially in the third chapter, he has these very long descriptions. Because I think that Rossi was very much interested in this category that for Bergson, Holbachs and Poet, who were students of Bergson, was very important, which is the idea of durée. The idea of how you said in English, durée, duration, as opposed to the idea of time, which is, especially chronological time, because the idea of duration is a far more complex, nuanced understanding of time. Rossi, I don't think he was familiar with Bergson, but it's interesting that Holbachs and Poet were students of Bergson. And in fact, this idea of durée is very important in their work. And for Rossi, only the historical city, especially the examples he put forward, had that sort of temporal dimension, no? Which modern architecture, especially with the idea of the plan, no? Which is a very synchronic drawing. The plan really is a diagram at the end. It's very synchronic kind of reading of the city, completely eliminates. Actually, that's why I think in the Cittanaloga he used this, durée, this kind of idea of known plan, And that's actually why when he described these examples that you mentioned, he makes very short, as you said, very short comments, and is not really able to formulate something more, let's say, more, much longer than the very few observations. Yeah.
I'd like to return to Venturi and to the main thematic of this series of seminars and ask you about your own take on Venturi's work as a project for the city.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
The question is your take on Venturi's work as a project for a city, because today you emphasized his taking distance from it.
Yeah, well, I think that, as I said, there are two Venturis, complexity and contradiction, and learning from Las Vegas. And I think that the Venturi's project on the city is Denise Scott Brown. I think he would not, I think it's a very fair comment to make. She had huge impact on Venturi's understanding of the city. I think that I have to say I'm very critical, of course, of their project. For me, learning from Las Vegas is really like the manifesto of what we have, no? Not so much of the architecture, but the values and ideologies that they celebrate. It's exactly the celebration of those values that have won in the last 40 years, no? What actually has changed is the architecture, but the values that they celebrate, the idea of letting things to be as they are, no? To celebrate basically an architecture that is driven by pure market concern, which is exactly what they put forward, of course in very elegant and ironical terms, but nevertheless that's the message. Well, I think that for me it's I will say something that of course will make a lot of people unhappy, and I'm sure it will make myself very unpopular, but I think that for me their work is extremely regressive. And that's actually why, as you might have noticed, I struggled to go through Venturi. I really don't like his work. I found his work really, because it's so powerful. I mean, what I really acknowledge is that Venturi is a brilliant writer, he's a brilliant mind. It's one of the finest, really architectural theorists. Far more than anybody else. I think far more than Rossi, for sure. Far more than Colas. But I found his message, I mean, his idea, as you call it, the project on the city, which is not just a project of forms, but really an ethical, moral, ideological project, absolutely regressive. And I'm really amazed how architects are usually extremely positive in general, not especially more younger generations towards learning from Las Vegas, which I found it almost scary in its completely uncritical celebration of, and of course what redeemed that book for me is that it's a very beautiful book to read, at least has that, you know, it's a pleasant book to read, and I think is important. But I found it ideologically a book that I reject. I really hate it. And to a certain extent also complex in contradiction. It's a book that makes me really uncomfortable. And yeah, I'm very critical. I think it's a very acritical book that no matter how smart, how cool, how intelligent, it has, its side effect is this total indifference towards the city, which I think for me is the fundamental problem of today's architecture.
You managed to talk about Venturi and Rossi without mentioning, you know, historicism or even history,
Yes.
which I find amazing, especially since all the revivals and historicist architecture kind of emerged, perhaps even, you know, from these plans or from their project, whereas both of them had I have a feeling at least that had a very different understanding of what was that. For Venturi, I would say that it was a kind of irony expressed. For Rossi, it's an open question because you said that he shifted, he kind of abandoned the project.
Well, I think that this sort of historicist issue was very much exacerbated by what came before them, which was really the complete denial of history. No? You think of the Bauhaus, for example, where courses about history of architecture were abolished. And so that's actually what makes then their work so apparently so much historicist. But I think that for me it's different because their approach to history is very different, because Venturi is very inclusive. I mean, his understanding of history is like a big shopping mall of formal variations. Venturi has really no understanding of history. I mean, in fact, there is no history in his book. It's basically a big shelf with all kinds of formal possibilities, but in fact, what is really absent in his work is history, and that's actually one of the most powerful aspects of his books, the complete removal of history, you know? So that allows him to basically put Le Corbusier next to Soane, next to Bernini, or next to Michelangelo. No? On the contrary, Rossi actually has a very more more nuanced relationship with history. Rossi actually, as I said before, is not so much interested in history as a chronological framework. And this actually really becomes evident in the idea of the città. But really, as, his understanding of history is very much mediated through this holistic approach of the School of French Geography, where paradigms, examples, play a fundamental role. And examples are really those elements that put forward what Rossi would call a tendency. The word tendenza, which is exactly what Rossi used for his sort of school or movement, is a fundamental Marxian category. The tendency is to choose one example, even the most marginal, or the most, and make it the paradigm through which to read all the rest. Marx actually, the way of reading Capital of Marx is based on this idea of tendency. He chose industrial labor, not because it was the most important form of labor, because in fact, even in England at the time, agriculture was far more, important. But he used the most advanced, very peculiar example through which he reread the entire history of labor. So this idea is very political in itself, because the choice of examples and paradigms of the tendency, it's not like Venturi. You cannot choose whatever. You have to be very strategic. And I think that for me, that's actually the way Rossi reads history. For Rossi, history is not a chronological framework, but is the possibility of finding a tendency. And that tendency, of course, has political and ideological connotations. Okay, so thanks. One last question. No. Yeah.
It's just a short one.
Yeah.
But how for you this Rossi Città differs from Piranesi Campo Marzio 200 years earlier?
Well, actually, I think I would say that they belong to the same species. I think there are two projects that work with the same idea of a known plan, of rejecting the most, in Piranesi actually this idea of the relationship with the plan is very strong because of course it's a critique to Nolli plan of Rome. But nevertheless, in both this idea of composition, the idea of exemplarity, the idea of working through tendencies, in Piranesi, the tendency is the idea of Roman architecture against the idea of classical architecture according to the Greeks, is very important. So I think that, yes, the Città works within that sort of approach which was invented in a way by Piranesi. Okay. Thanks a lot for being here.